You'll have to forgive me if I seem a bit on edge these days. Living through the events of the last few months has left me pretty shaken up, to say the least. I'm not sure I'll ever feel truly safe again. It all started a few months ago when my wife Sarah and I moved into our new house in the suburbs. It was a nice little two-story place in a pleasant neighborhood. Exactly what we'd been looking for to start a family. Little did we know the nightmares that were in store for us. At first, everything seemed totally normal. We spent those first few weeks unpacking, getting settled in, meeting some of the neighbors. They all seemed friendly enough. All except one, that is. Looking back, I realized there were little things about our next-door neighbor that should have tipped me off from the beginning that something wasn't quite right with him. His name was Jerry, and he was a man probably in his late 50s who lived alone. Whenever we saw him outside doing yard work or getting his mail, he always kept to himself, never waving or saying hello like the other neighbors. He just had this strange, unsettling vibe about him, but I tried not to read too much into it at first. He's probably just an introvert who likes to keep to himself, I reasoned at the time. How wrong I was. The first really bizarre incident happened maybe a week after we moved in. I was out front one Saturday morning washing my car, music playing through my headphones as I worked. At one point, I happened to glance over toward Jerry's house and noticed his curtains moving ever so slightly. I thought maybe he was just looking out the window. But then it happened again a few minutes later. And again. It was like he was peeking out discreetly but didn't want to be seen. An unsettling feeling started creeping over me, but I tried to shake it off, convincing myself I was probably just being paranoid. Over the following weeks, however, the incidents only grew more frequent and more disturbing. There were days when it seemed like every time I went outside, I could almost sense Jerry's eyes following me from behind those curtains. He was always watching, like some kind of deranged sentinel. Sometimes I'd catch him standing perfectly still in the shadows of his backyard, shrouded in darkness as he peered through the bushes separating our properties. I'd be doing something as innocuous as grilling on the patio, and I'd look over to see his hollow eyes fixated on me. Anytime I tried to make eye contact or wave, he'd immediately retreat back inside like a frightened animal. One day, Sarah and I were lounging by the pool in our backyard when all of a sudden this strange crunching sound started coming from the bushes. We both froze, wondering if maybe it was a rabid raccoon or something. But then I realized with the chill that the sound seemed to be moving, slowly making its way along the length of the bushes, like someone was creeping behind them, peering through at us. Sarah must have sensed it too, because she grabbed my arm and we both fled inside, locking all the doors and windows. I'm embarrassed to admit this, but we ended up having to sleep in the guest bedroom toward the front of the house that night because we were too freaked out by the idea of Jerry being able to look in from the bushes behind our bedroom. From there, the situation only grew more twisted and unnerving. There were the times Sarah thought she heard faint footsteps outside our bedroom window in the dead of night, or felt like she was being watched while folding laundry in the backyard. One evening, I was upstairs fixing the cable box when an odd smell hit my nostrils, like rotting animal carcass. I followed the scent until it led me to our bedroom window. And there on the sill were what looked like fecal streaks, almost like a dog had marked its territory. That was the night we first considered installing a security system and cameras. But even that didn't do much to quell our growing fears. A few weeks after the fecal incident, we were reviewing the security footage when we noticed something on the tape that made our blood run cold. At around 3 a.m., the camera clearly caught a figure lurking in the shadows of our backyard, concealed behind the bushes, and watching our bedroom window for several minutes before disappearing again. The angle didn't allow us to see who it was, but we were both haunted by that unmistakable sensation of being studied, hunted. From there, it was just a living nightmare. The noises in the night grew more frequent. Scurrying footsteps outside our bedroom, faint scratching sounds on the walls or windows like fingernails, things being moved around in the backyard. We lived in a perpetual state of hypervigilance, jumping at every creak and thump. The strain was starting to really take its toll, both emotionally and physically. Sarah could hardly sleep through the night anymore without waking up in a cold sweat, swearing she could feel someone's eyes on her. I began suspecting Jerry more and more, despite having no concrete proof he was behind it all. I tried peering over at his house to see if I could spot any movement from his windows, but his curtains always remained drawn. It was like he was taunting us, knowing we were powerless to catch him in the act. One night, I finally mustered up the courage to call the police. An officer came over and checked the premises, but unsurprisingly found no signs of a break-in or anything conspicuous around the property. He did agree to swing by Jerry's house to have a friendly word with him, just to be on the safe side. The next day, the officer knocked on our door again, with a grave look on his face. According to the officer, there had been no one living next door during this time. Jerry, who was supposed to be the occupant of that house, had been confined to a nursing home for the last 3 months, recovering from a stroke. His house had been vacant the entire time, ever since his son moved him out to get medical care. The police had verified his story, eliminating him as a suspect. But that revelation only made the lingering presence feel exponentially more menacing. If it wasn't the neighbor we assumed was behind it all, then who or what had been tormenting us? Sarah and I recoiled in sheer terror. All those days of being watched, all those bone-chilling encounters in our own backyard. It wasn't the creepy neighbor at all. It was something else. Something that had been studying us, observing our routines, dwelling in the darkness without ever being seen. An unseeable force had violated the sanctity of our home, our safe space, and made us feel like prisoners in our own house. How had it slipped past our security? How had it moved so stealthily about the property without being picked up on camera? The questions overwhelmed us, our minds spinning at the implications. We had prepared ourselves for a creepy neighbor, but this was something more insidious. A question suddenly popped into my head. Was it even human? Or was it an ethereal tormentor without a corporeal form, capable of going unseen while it slowly unmade our reality? Paranoia gripped me like I've never known. Every flicker of movement in my peripheral vision made me start, wondering if I'd finally catch a glimpse of our twisted stalker. At night, the sounds of the house, settling and creaking, took on sinister new dimensions. As my imagination ran wild trying to decode each groan and thump. Was something in the vents? In the walls? In the room with us? The psychological terror was relentless, not knowing what kind of force we were dealing with, or how to defend ourselves against such a malignant, unseen presence. We couldn't flee. We couldn't hide. Wherever we went, it would simply follow and resume its torment. So we tried taking every possible precaution to fortify our home, almost like building an actual panic room. Stronger locks, new security cameras, lights left on at all hours. Maybe if we couldn't see it, at least we could try to make it more difficult for it to see us. But no matter what measures we took, the ominous phenomena persisted. Terrifying audio cues in the dead of night, the inescapable sense of being studied, of having our most intimate moments spied upon, the gnawing dread that this malevolent specter could strike at any time, with no way to counter its advances. Until one day, it just suddenly stopped. No strange noises. The maddening feeling of being watched washed away, like it was never there. It was silent. Looking back now, part of me wonders if we somehow opened a door to the supernatural that should have remained sealed. Maybe in that house, some disturbing events occurred in the past that left a harmful psychic imprint, one that attached itself to us simply by being the new inhabitants. Maybe it lost interest in us and left to find another, a more interesting prey. All I know is we never did find any rational explanation for those dark months of torment and psychological torture. The whispering settled, the strange noises faded, but the underlying feeling of dread never left us, like a scar that would never fully heal. So you can forgive my skittishness, can't you? That bone-deep unease that comes from knowing there are darker forces in this world than we can comprehend. Knowing that even in your own home, you may not truly be alone or safe. So tread carefully, dear listener. I pray that the sinister presence never finds you like it found us. It was a dreary night when the rain beat incessantly against the window pane, as if trying to cleanse the city of its sins. Nursing a bitter cup of coffee in the quiet cafe, I tried to drown my thoughts in the hum of low conversations and the soft jazz that whispered through the speakers. That's when I saw him, the fortune teller. He was an anomaly, dressed in a long, tattered coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his eyes, sitting alone in a dim corner. A small, worn sign on his table whispered in the glow of the candle, "Discover your destiny." Driven by a mixture of skepticism and a quiet desperation for anything that might disrupt the monotony of my days, I approached him. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, my voice almost lost in the swell of a saxophone solo. He nodded slowly, his face still hidden beneath the hat. As I sat, he pushed a small, velvet-covered box toward me. "Pick one," he said, his voice raspy, like the rustle of dry leaves. Inside the box, I found a collection of ancient-looking tarot cards. I hesitated, then drew one. The moon. I laid it on the table. He finally looked up. His eyes were startlingly clear, the kind that seemed to pierce through to the soul, seeing its every hidden corner. "The moon," he murmured, "a reflection of fears and illusions. Be wary of deceits, or perhaps deceiving yourself." I scoffed lightly. "I'm not sure I believe in this stuff." "Belief is not a requirement for truth," he replied, his gaze never wavering from mine. He began to shuffle the deck again, the cards flipping with a smooth, rhythmic precision. He stopped abruptly and spread them out before me, face down. "Choose another." This time I pulled the Tower. Catastrophe, sudden upheaval, chaos. His fingers trembled slightly as he placed the card next to the moon. "A storm is coming in your life, one that may shake the very foundations of your world," he said softly. I felt a chill, despite the warmth of the cafe. "Is there a way to avoid it?" "Some storms must be weathered," he replied, gathering the cards. His cryptic words lingered in the air as the candle between us flickered. He seemed to grow larger, the shadows stretching his form until it merged with the darkness of the cafe. "Another card?" he whispered. Reluctantly, I drew another card. Death. I froze, the image of the skeletal figure on horseback staring back at me, mocking my fear. The end of one phase, the beginning of another. "A transformation," he said, noting my alarm. "It's not always literal." As he spoke, the cafe seemed to grow colder. His face became more gaunt, his eyes deeper. I realized with a start that the other patrons had left. It was just us, enveloped in a silence that was thick with my growing dread. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice unsteady. "A mere messenger," he replied, his smile thin. "Would you like to continue, or are you satisfied with the glimpse of what's to come?" I should have left then, but curiosity, that insidious, whispering seducer, urged me to stay. "One more," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded, an almost imperceptible motion, and fanned the cards out with a deliberate slowness. I drew again. The devil. "Obsession, bondage to material, the shadow self," he intoned. His eyes were no longer merely piercing. They burned with an intensity that felt invasive, as if he were rearranging my very thoughts. As I looked at the card, the image began to move, the chains rattling and the devil's eyes glowing red. I blinked, shaking my head, sure my eyes were deceiving me. "This isn't real," I said, pushing the card away. "All things perceived are as real as they are believed," he replied cryptically. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the old cafe floor. "I need to leave." "As you wish," he said calmly. "But remember, the cards never lie." Rushing out into the rainy night, I felt his eyes on my back. The weight of his predictions hung heavy in my mind. The street was deserted, the usual nightlife seemingly swallowed by the shadows. Heart pounding, I continued home, the rain soaking through my clothes. When I finally reached my apartment, I was trembling, not just from the cold, but from the fear that something had followed me from the cafe. That night, I couldn't sleep well, feeling restless. The cards, especially the devil, haunted me. As dawn approached, I was feeling exhausted and my entire body was aching. I got up and tried to convince myself that it was all just a bad dream. I caught my reflection in a mirror, expecting to see my haggard, sleepless face. However, I saw it. A flash of red in my eyes. My eyes were glowing red. Terrified, I stepped back, stumbling over a chair. As I fell, my eyes caught the moon, full and bright, illuminating my room with a ghostly light. The tarot card's warning echoed in my mind. Be wary of deceits, or perhaps deceiving yourself. I've always been drawn to the water. There's something about its calmness that has always been a source of comfort for me. So when I inherited my grandparents' old lakeside cabin, I was thrilled. It had been years since I last visited, but I remembered the lake as serene blue, its surface smooth and inviting. I decided to take a week off from work to fix up the cabin and reconnect with those cherished childhood memories. The drive to the cabin was longer than I remembered, and as I turned down the narrow, winding road that led to the property, an unsettling feeling began to creep over me. The forest seemed denser, the shadows darker. By the time I arrived, dusk was falling, and the lake was shrouded in the thick, eerie mist. The cabin was just as I remembered, though more run down. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the smell of must and age greeting me. I set my bags down and opened the windows to let in some fresh air, then decided to take a walk to the lake before it got too dark. The path to the water's edge was overgrown, but I managed to push through. As I approached the lake, I felt a sudden chill. The mist hung low over the water, and I could barely see the opposite shore. I stood there for a while, listening to the surrounding. There were no sounds of birds or insects, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in on me. The stillness of the lake was unnerving. The very same that I remembered as calming now was suffocating to me. As I stood on the shore, the mist began to swirl subtly, as if stirred by an unseen hand. My breath became visible in the air, mingling with the fog and ghostly wisps. The edges of the lake blurred into the encroaching darkness. Something about the lake's changed appearance tugged at the edges of my memory. A warning, perhaps, or a story long forgotten, told in hushed tones by my grandparents. They spoke of the lake not just as a body of water, but as a living, breathing entity, possessing a soul that was ancient and deep. As the darkness deepened, the mist thickened, moving in unnatural patterns. A gnawing, unsettling feeling caught hold of me. I tried to turn and rush back to the cabin, but stopped when a deep, melodic hum pierced the silence. It was dark and foreboding, like the thrumming heartbeat of the earth, reverberating with an unsettling power as if an ancient being were awakening from their slumber in the shadowy depths of the water. The humming grew louder. It resonated with a sorrow that felt as old as the lake itself. That's when I noticed the ripples. They began at the center of the lake, spreading outward as if something beneath the surface was emerging. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest as the water broke. But nothing emerged. No creature, no object. Instead, the ripples continued, forming patterns that seemed almost deliberate, encircling the area directly in front of me. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft, whispering voice. It was so low I could barely make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was pleading, urging me to listen, to understand. "Do not linger here," it breathed, the voice dissolving into the mist as quickly as it had appeared. Fear overrode my fascination, sending a surge of adrenaline through my veins. I backed away from the water's edge, each step cautious and slow, as though I was afraid to disturb the lake further. Back inside the cabin, I locked the doors and windows, drawing the curtains tight. My heart still raced. I realized then that the serenity of the lake was a facade, a mask worn over something ancient and unknowable, something that did not want to be disturbed. That night, the silence was oppressive. The mist pressed against the windows as if trying to get inside, to reach me. I didn't sleep, instead, watching the shifting shadows, listening to the haunting absence of natural sound. As dawn broke, the morning light did little to dispel the dread that had settled over me. I had planned to spend a week here, reconnecting with the serene memories of my childhood visits. But the lake had changed. Or perhaps it had always harbored that chilling presence, hidden beneath its tranquil surface, and I had been trying to forget what I had experienced here in the past. As I loaded the last of my bags into the car, a cold breeze swept past, carrying a moist, earthy scent. It was then that I noticed something unsettling. Wet marks leading from the lake. A shiver ran down my spine as I followed the trail of water with my eyes, ending abruptly at the cabin's entrance. Inside, the floor was damp, with small puddles of water near the windows and door, as if the lake itself had tried to follow me inside. The drive away from the lake was tense, each mile adding to the weight of the unsettling reality that my connection to the lake was far from over. I had inherited this place from my childhood, but also its legacy of secrets and its haunting curse. I started working the night shift at the museum 3 months ago. The job was simple: patrol the halls, check the locks, and monitor the cameras. The museum was an old mansion, converted in the late 1800s, its walls thick with history, and its corridors filled with shadows that seemed almost alive in the flickering light of my flashlight. The first few nights were uneventful. I grew accustomed to the echoing footsteps, the occasional creak of the settling wood, and the distant, almost imperceptible whisper of the wind through the ancient bricks. However, one night, something changed. It was a little past 2 a.m., and I was in the security room sipping stale coffee, my eyes glued to the bank of CCTV screens in front of me. The cameras covered all angles of the museum's interior, the exhibits immobile in their eternal poses. Then, on camera 4, the one overseeing the long hallway of the East Wing, where the portraits of long-dead aristocrats hung, I noticed something odd. There was an extra portrait, a person I never saw before in the frame. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, thinking the fatigue was playing tricks on me. But there it was, the portrait, clear as day. A woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, her face obscured by the length of her dark, tangled hair. I checked the timestamp. It hadn't faltered. This was live footage. Heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and keys and made my way to the East Wing. The air grew colder as I approached, my breath visible in the beam of my light. When I reached the spot where I had seen her, there was nothing but the familiar stern-faced portrait staring back at me. Confused and a little unnerved, I studied each painting carefully. Their musty smell filled the air, a blend of old canvas and heavier, unplaceable odors. The gilded frames reflected the weak light of my flashlight, throwing eerie, dancing shadows against the walls. No new portrait was among them. Could my mind have conjured that image? Shaken, I headed back, the sense of unease growing with each step. The museum felt different now, as if the very atmosphere had thickened. When I returned to the security room, I scrutinized the footage, rewinding it to the moment I saw the mysterious portrait. It was still there on the playback, undeniably real and chillingly detailed. The portrait showed the woman in white, her eyes now visible, piercingly bright even through the grainy footage. She seemed to be looking right at me, her gaze unnerving and intense. I printed a still image from the video, determined to compare it again with the wall. Armed with the printout, I walked back to the East Wing. The mansion creaked around me, as if protesting my intrusion into its secrets. When I reached the hallway, the lights flickered, and a cold draft swept through, chilling me to the bone. I held the paper next to the portraits. The woman was not there. Suddenly, the lights went out completely. I flicked on my flashlight, and there, in its beam, was the portrait. Not hanging on the wall, but standing in the hallway, framed by darkness. I stumbled back in shock, my heart hammering. The portrait began to move, stepping out of its frame. A living, breathing figure, her gown flowing ghostly around her. She walked towards me, and I could see her face clearly now. It was beautiful but sorrowful, with a deep sadness that seemed almost eternal. She stopped a few feet away, Her eyes locked on mine. "Find me," she whispered, her voice a melodious echo that filled the corridor. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. When the light stuttered back to life, she was gone. No trace of the portrait remained. Not in the hallway, not on the walls, nor on the camera feed when I rushed back to check. Throughout the night since, her appearances became more frequent and unsettling. No longer confined to just the one camera, her image started appearing in reflections, even in the periphery of my vision as I walked the halls. Each encounter left a colder, more suffocating air in its wake. Returning to the east wing to confront the space where her portrait first appeared, I found the entire hallway shrouded in darkness, the lights refusing to turn on. With only the beam of my flashlight to guide me, I approached the spot, my heart thundering against my ribs. As the light swept over the walls, it caught her figure, not in a portrait, but standing at the very end of the hall, looking directly at me. She whispered, not just through the air this time, but in my mind, a visceral echo that felt as if it was emanating from the walls themselves. "Join me," she said, her voice both beautiful and horrifying. It was no longer a plea, it felt like a command. The flashlight flickered violently and went out, plunging me into an oppressive darkness that seemed to pulse with silent, waiting malevolence. When the lights stuttered back to life, she was gone. I turned slowly, my breath caught in my throat. Behind me, the portraits looked different. Their faces, once regal and composed, were twisted in expressions of horror, their painted eyes wide with fear. It started on a crisp October evening when the veil between seasons thinned, and the whispers of winter began to chill the spine. I had always been fascinated by the obscure and forgotten. So when I first heard about the house, without windows nestled at the end of Willow Lane, it wasn't fear, but curiosity that pulled me towards it. The locals avoided speaking of it, merely exchanging glances that spoke volumes of shared, silent horror. The house, they said, had stood there for as long as anyone could remember. Its history as murky and obscured as its dark, windowless facades. They warned me, with earnest eyes, to steer clear. But warnings often fuel the desires they mean to quell. I approached the house as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world into a deep, unsettling orange. The structure loomed like a shadow against the fading light, its surface a seamless, uninterrupted black. No windows, no way to peer inside, as if it had been designed to keep its secrets locked away from prying eyes. The air grew colder as I neared the front door, a heavy wooden thing, surprisingly well maintained amidst the decay. With a hesitant hand, I pushed it open. The door groaned on its hinges, an unwelcome yet anticipated greeting. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic. The interior was darker than the twilight outside. I flicked on my flashlight, and the beam cut through the darkness like a solid thing. The walls were lined with old portraits, faces watching from the past, eyes that seemed to follow my every move. Each room was a repetition of the last, oppressive, suffocating, with an ever-present sense of being observed. It was in the back of the house that I found the staircase leading downwards. The basement, I thought, might hold some clue as to why this house was so feared. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound unnervingly loud in the encompassing silence. When my feet finally found the dirt floor, the air turned colder, the back of my neck prickling with the electricity of unseen eyes. The basement was expansive, far larger than the house above suggested. My light seemed to swallow up in the darkness, as if the shadows themselves consumed it. Then I saw them, outlines of figures etched against the far wall. Not paintings, not statues, but something else entirely. They were darker than the surrounding darkness, a deeper shade of black that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I stood frozen as the figures began to move, their forms undulating like smoke. A whisper filled the air, a susurrus of voices so soft I thought I might have imagined them. But then they grew, a cacophony of whispers, each one repeating a single, chilling word. Leave. Panic set in, a primal urge to flee from something wholly unnatural. I turned to run, but my flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. As I ascended the stairs, the whispers grew louder, angrier. The door at the top, which I had left ajar, slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. I threw myself against it, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned to screams, a sound so terrifying it seemed to scrape against my bones. I felt something cold brush against my back, a touch that burned like ice. With a desperate strength born of pure fear, I slammed once more against the door. It flew open and I stumbled out into the night, the screams still echoing behind me. Outside, the world seemed too still, the night air too calm. I didn't look back as I ran from the house that should not be. When I reached the safety of my own home, I locked the doors and collapsed against them, my breath ragged, my body trembling. But even now, as I write this, the feeling of being watched has not left me. Sometimes when the house is silent and the night presses against the windows of my room, I hear it, the faintest whisper, carried on the wind. I realize then that the night provides the perfect solace to those hiding from the light. I first noticed it a month ago on a chilly evening as I walked home from work. I'd had a long day and was eager to get home, but something felt off. The streets were unusually quiet. As I turned onto my street, I noticed a figure standing under a streetlight, their features obscured by the hood of a dark coat. They were still almost unnaturally so, and a shiver ran down my spine. I quickened my pace, feeling an inexplicable urge to get home as fast as possible. When I glanced back, the figure was gone, leaving me wondering if I had imagined it. The following nights were no better. Night after night, without fail, I would catch sight of it lurking in the shadows, always just far enough away to be indistinct. Its persistence unnerved me. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, or a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. One evening as I walked home with groceries, the feeling of being watched intensified. I glanced over my shoulder and there it was, standing beneath a streetlight behind me. My heart raced and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty street. The figure didn't move or respond. I took a step closer. "What do you want?" I asked. The figure remained silent, its presence a dark, oppressive force. I felt a chill wash over me, colder than the rain-soaked air. The figure didn't respond, it just stood there, silent and ominous. Panic surged through me, and I turned and ran, my footsteps splashing through the puddles as I fled. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside made my pulse quicken. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, convinced that if I closed my eyes, the figure would somehow get inside. Days turned into weeks, and the figure grew bolder. I started seeing it not just at night, but also in the dimly lit corners of the hospital where I worked. It lingered at the end of empty hallways, appeared in the reflection of glass doors. Always watching, determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to confront the figure. That evening, I left work later than usual, hoping the cover of darkness would provide me the opportunity to catch my stalker off guard. As I neared my street, I saw the figure again, standing in its usual spot under the streetlight. While maintaining a safe distance, desperate for answers, I shouted again, "Who are you? Why don't you say something? At least talk to me. Tell me, what do you want?" Then, to my horror, the figure began to move slowly, deliberately toward me. Gripped by fear, I immediately turned around and started making my way back home. It followed me closely, its footsteps echoing mine. Chills ran through me as I broke into a run, but the figure matched my pace effortlessly. I burst into my apartment, slamming the door behind me and leaning against it, gasping for breath. My heart pounded as I listened for any sign of the figure, but the apartment was silent. I cautiously peered through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. That night as I lay in bed, I felt an oppressive presence in the room. I turned on the bedside lamp, and there it was, standing at the foot of my bed, shrouded in darkness. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It felt as if a weight was pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. The figure slowly raised an arm, pointing a shadowy finger at me, and then it spoke. Its voice was a chilling whisper, echoing in my mind. "You invited me," it said, its tone cold and devoid of emotion. I felt a shiver run down my spine. "What do you mean?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The figure's form seemed to solidify, its presence becoming even more menacing. "You spoke to me," it replied. "You acknowledged me. That is all the invitation I needed." I realized with growing horror that my attempts to confront and understand it had only drawn it closer. I had broken some unseen barrier, allowing this dark entity into my life. Terrified but desperate, I grasped for any semblance of control. "How can I unbind you? How can I send you back?" The figure laughed, a sound that chilled my blood. "There is no simple return. I do not abide by the laws you understand. But know this, I am here now because you opened the door, and I will stay as long as the door remains open." The figure dissolved into the darkness, leaving me with those cryptic words, leaving me in chilling solitude. I knew I had unwittingly tethered myself to something ancient and unknowable. Even now, I sometimes catch a glimpse of a shadow in the corner of my eye, a reminder of that dark presence. In the heart of a forgotten village, wreathed in the mists of the moor, stands the ancient church of St. Eldred's. Its stone walls, thick with the ivy of centuries. The architecture, a relic of the ancient days. As the newly appointed priest of St. Eldred's, I was drawn not by the promise of a devoted flock. There were but a few scattered souls remaining, but by the allure of its vast library of ancient texts and the solitude that such a place promised. My arrival was not marked by tradition or ceremony, but by a quiet handing over of duties from an elderly clergyman whose eyes hinted at deeper secrets than the church's visibly decaying archives could hold. The church had always intrigued me, with its somber beauty and folk legends. It was said to be a place of great power and great peril, where the veil between the seen and unseen was thin. I had taken these tales as the typical lore that shrouds old places. However, on a particular night, underscored by a relentless storm, howling through the gables like a chorus of the damned, I discovered something I wish I never did. In the sacristy, where I had spent countless hours cataloging texts and artifacts, a door now stood where none had been before. A tall, narrow portal, carved from dark wood and bound in iron, sealed with a rusted iron padlock, inscribed with strange symbols that writhed unnervingly under my gaze. I was certain this door had not existed before, yet here it was as if it had always been waiting. Driven by an insatiable curiosity and the surreal, otherworldly atmosphere lent by the storm, I remembered the shimmering, odd key given to me under cryptically at the time of my arrival. It fit perfectly, turning with a reluctant groan that seemed to resonate deeper than the storm itself, unlocking the door that I was certain had not existed before. As the door creaked open, it revealed a room swallowed by shadows, a stark contrast to the flickering lightning outside. I hesitated, my instincts screaming to seal what had been so deliberately hidden. Yet, compelled by a deeper, inexplicable force, I lit a candle and stepped inside. The room was oppressive, with air thick with the smell of decay and something acrid, almost sweet, like rotting flesh mingled with incense. Shelves lined with obscure texts and artifacts filled the space. But it was the center of the room that drew my eyes. An old wooden table with a single book resting upon it, its cover unmarked and binding plain, yet emanating a palpable sense of anticipation. As the candlelight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced with the storm's rhythm, its sickly yellow cover was clasped shut, not with a lock, but with fastenings that seemed to twitch eagerly as I approached. Compelled beyond reason, I approached the table and opened the book. The pages were blank, eerily so, but as I stared, words began to appear, ink blossoming on the page like dark flowers. The book was writing itself, recounting histories not known to any scholar, secrets of the cosmos and of realms shadowed from human sight. Outside, the storm intensified, as though it responded to the book's revelations. Thunder cracked sharply, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the church, the words continuing to write themselves faster, more urgently. As I read, the sense of being watched grew overwhelming. I was not alone. Turning slowly, I saw nothing but felt an undeniable presence, an intelligence vast and ancient, observing me through unseen eyes. The air grew thick, and the room seemed to close in around me, the shadows deepening, stretching. With each word I read, reality seemed to warp, the edges of the room blurring and twisting. I realized then that the book was not merely recounting tales. It was a key itself, a gateway, being pried open between our world and another, dark and vast. I'd snapped the book shut, heart pounding with a primal fear and an awestruck curiosity. The storm abruptly died as if it had never been, leaving a silence so profound it hummed in my ears. The room felt normal again, mundane, as if the moments of terror had been nothing but a figment of my imagination. But the air had changed. There was a coolness, a whisper of something else, a fragrance not belonging to our world. I locked the book inside the room, resealing the door with the shimmering key, aware now of its purpose, to keep closed the doorway between realms, a boundary not meant to be crossed. In the quiet moments of my daily duties, the shadows at the edges of my vision seemed to stretch towards me, the whispers of the key growing louder. I fear a battle is brewing within me. The key tempts relentlessly, the dark secrets of the book beckoning endlessly, and I am left haunted by the thought that one day my resolve might falter, and on that day, what lies locked behind that door may no longer be contained. Growing up on a farm in the middle of nowhere, I often felt isolated, surrounded by endless fields of corn and wheat. My father, a stern man of few words, and my mother, a kind but weary woman, worked tirelessly to keep our farm running. One hot summer afternoon, my father tasked me with building a new scarecrow. Our old one had fallen apart after years of standing guard. With a sigh, I grabbed some old clothes, straw, and a burlap sack from the barn. I used an old pair of my father's clothes and stuffed them with straw. For the head, I used the burlap sack, drawing a crude face with a black marker. The eyes were large and round, the nose a simple triangle, and the mouth a wide, crooked grin. Despite my lack of artistic skill, I couldn't shake the feeling that the face looked eerily lifelike. I shrugged off the unease and carried the scarecrow to the middle of the field, where I secured it to a wooden stake. As the sun began to set, I stood back and admired my handiwork. The scarecrow stood tall, arms outstretched as if welcoming the twilight. That night I struggled to sleep. I kept picturing the scarecrow's face, the way its grin seemed to widen in the fading light. I chalked it up to my overactive imagination and eventually drifted off, only to be awakened by a loud rustling sound outside my window. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The noise continued, a rhythmic rustling that seemed to be coming from the direction of the field. I told myself it was just the wind, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept downstairs, careful not to wake my parents, and slipped. I followed the sound of the field out the back door. The night air was cool and the moon cast an eerie glow over the farm. As I approached the scarecrow, the rustling grew louder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The scarecrow was moving. Its arms swayed back and forth as if caught in an invisible breeze. But there was no wind. I took a step closer. The scarecrow's head turned slowly, its painted eyes locking onto mine. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back in the safety of the house. I locked the door behind me, panting, I must have imagined it, I thought. I was tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. When morning came, I knew I had to face my fear. I grabbed a pitchfork and headed to the field. The Scarecrow stood in its usual spot, motionless. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached out and touched the burlap sack, half expecting it to move. It remained still, just a lifeless bundle of straw. However, I noticed something strange. There were footprints, large and heavy, leading away from the stake. I followed the footprints, my mind racing with possibilities. They led me to the edge of the field where they abruptly stopped. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of whatever had made them. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the rustling sound. Hours passed, and just as I began to drift off, I heard it again. This time it was louder, more insistent. I sat up, heart racing, and peered through the curtains. My blood ran cold. The Scarecrow was standing in the yard, its head tilted to one side, its painted eyes staring up at me. I screamed and stumbled back, tripping over a chair. My parents came running, their faces pale with worry. I tried to explain, but the words caught in my throat. My father grabbed his shotgun and headed outside, my mother and I close behind. The Scarecrow was gone, leaving only footprints in the dirt. We followed them. They led us to the barn, where the door hung open, swaying in the breeze. We stepped inside. In the dim light, I saw it. The Scarecrow was slumped in the corner, its limbs twisted at odd angles. My father approached cautiously, his shotgun at the ready. My mother held me close, her hands trembling. As my father reached out to touch it, the Scarecrow jerked upright with a violent motion. My father stumbled back, raising his shotgun, but the Scarecrow was faster. It lunged towards the open barn door, its movements unnatural and jerky. My father fired, but the shot went wide. The Scarecrow disappeared into the night, leaving us in stunned silence. We spent the rest of the night in the living room, my father keeping watch with his shotgun, my mother clutching a kitchen knife. None of us slept. The next morning, we searched the farm, but there was no sign of the Scarecrow. It had vanished, leaving only the disturbed earth and a sense of lingering dread. I never saw it again since. Though even now, as an adult, I can't look at a Scarecrow without feeling a chill run down my spine. And I wonder if it's truly gone, or if it's still out there waiting. When my sister Ava and I rented a cabin for a weekend getaway, we were drawn to its charming seclusion and promise of an untouched, snowy landscape. Situated in the northern woods, the cabin offered a stunning view, with sprawling pine trees and pristine snow as far as the eye could see. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sky already darkening. Snowflakes fluttered around us like delicate whispers as we unloaded our supplies. The cabin, a quaint structure with creaky wooden floors and an old stone fireplace, felt like stepping back in time. It was colder inside than we'd anticipated, the chill of the air almost unnatural. We spent the evening huddled by the fire, playing cards and sipping hot chocolate. The wind howled outside, its eerie moans and sharp gusts against the cabin walls, creating an unsettling symphony. Ava laughed it off, but I sensed something was off. The cold seemed to seep into my bones, a deep, relentless freeze no fire could quell. As night deepened, the temperature inside dropped inexplicably. We piled on every blanket we could find, yet the cold was pervasive, as if it emanated from within the walls themselves. Ava, usually unflappable, whispered, "Do you feel that? It's like the cold is alive, reaching out for us." I tried to brush it off, telling her it was just the old cabin's poor insulation. But as we prepared for bed, the air grew so frigid we could see our breath. We decided to sleep in the same room, the only one where the fireplace seemed to hold some sway over the creeping frost. That night, I woke to the sound of scratching, faint but distinct, coming from the walls. Ava slept soundly, undisturbed, so I rose to investigate, my breath clouding in the beam of my flashlight. The scratching grew louder as I approached the corner of the room. Hesitant, I touched the wall, and the wood beneath my fingers felt unnaturally cold, almost icy. As I pressed closer, trying to locate the source of the sound, a chill ran down my spine. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. I stumbled back, heart racing, and woke Ava. She listened, eyes wide as the wail rose again, this time joined by a chorus of whispers. Too many to count, too soft to understand. Terrified, we packed our essentials and fled the room, determined to leave the cabin. As we hurriedly gathered our things by the front door, the temperature dropped sharply. It felt as if we were in the grip of an icy hand, its cold embrace paralyzing. The whispers grew louder, swirling around us, words beginning to form from the chaos. "Stay," they urged, over and over, until the voices were almost deafening. We didn't hesitate. Grabbing our bags, we opened the front door to a blast of cold that was somehow warmer than the air inside. We plunged into the snowy night, the cabin door slamming shut behind us with a force that echoed through the trees. Our car was covered in a thick layer of frost, and it took precious minutes to make it usable. As we started the engine and drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. For a moment, I could swear I saw figures standing at the windows, pale faces watching us leave, their expressions mournful and accusing. The drive back to civilization was silent, both of us processing what had happened. We agreed not to speak of it, fearful that giving voice to our experience would somehow make it more terrifying. As the weeks turned into months, the haunting memories of the cabin started to fade. One evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, I found a letter in the mailbox. It was from the owner of the cabin, apologizing for any inconvenience during our stay and inviting us back for a free weekend, claiming they had renovated and solved the insulation issues. Included in the letter was a photo of the cabin, looking serene and inviting under a fresh coat of snow. What unsettled me was not the offer or the picture itself, but the reflection in the cabin's window, an indistinct shape, almost like a shadow, but unmistakably the outline of a human figure. It was watching just as it had that night, face pressed against the glass, eyes obscured but presence felt. Ava called me that night, her voice trembling. "Did you get the letter?" she asked, barely a whisper. "Do you see it too?" We knew we couldn't return, not even to confront our fears. But each year, with the first snowfall, another letter would arrive, as if the cabin itself was reaching out, unwilling to let us forget. Each letter was a chilling reminder that what dwelled within those walls was not just a figment of our chilled, frightened imaginations. It was real, and it remembered us, relentlessly beckoning us back with the cold embrace of the forest. Good evening, friends. Tonight, instead of a song, I have a spine-tingling story to share with you. A tale of horror that will chill your bones and leave you questioning the very nature of music and creativity. I let the anticipation build, then began strumming my guitar, weaving a haunting melody to set the tone for the story. It all began a few months ago. I was a struggling musician, trapped in the throes of writer's block, desperate to find inspiration for my next song. I tried everything, changing locations, listening to different genres, even going on long walks to clear my mind. But nothing seemed to work. One night, as I lay awake in bed, frustration gnawing at my soul, I had an idea, a dangerous idea born of desperation. I'd heard whispers of musicians tapping into otherworldly realms for their art, using ancient rituals or bizarre practices to summon their muse. At the time, it seemed like a far-fetched notion, the stuff of urban legends. But at this point, I was willing to try anything just to get out of the rut. I scoured the darkest corners of the internet, digging through obscure forums and dusty tomes until I stumbled upon a strange ritual. It promised to open a channel to the depths of the subconscious mind, unlocking a wellspring of creativity. The instructions were vague and cryptic, written in a language that seemed to slither and writhe as I wrote it on a page. But I was too desperate to heed the warnings. At the stroke of midnight, I lit a single candle and sat cross-legged on the floor of my dimly lit studio. The shadows danced and flickered, casting eerie shapes on the walls. I closed my eyes and began to chant the guttural incantation, my voice low and raspy. The words felt foreign on my tongue, like a language long forgotten, a relic of a bygone age. As the final syllable left my lips, a chill ran down my spine. The air seemed to grow thick and heavy, pressing down on me from all sides. I opened my eyes, and for a moment, the world around me seemed to shift and contort, as if reality itself had been twisted into a nightmarish parody. Then, without warning, a melody began to take shape in my mind. It was unlike anything I'd ever conceived before, haunting, ethereal, and utterly captivating. The notes wove through the air like whispering tendrils, curling and undulating with an otherworldly grace, weaving themselves into a tapestry of sound that threatened to consume me whole. My fingers moved of their own accord, plucking the strings of my guitar, bringing the cursed tune to life. I played for what felt like an eternity, lost in the hypnotic rhythm, my mind a blank canvas upon which the notes danced their macabre ballet. When I finally came to, sweat beaded on my brow, and the candle had burned down to a mere stub. The shadows seemed to have grown longer, stretching across the room like grasping claws. An eerie silence hung in the air, as if the very walls were holding their breath. In the days that followed, that melody consumed my every waking thought. I found myself humming it constantly, the haunting refrain echoing in the depths of my mind. It was as if the song had taken root, a mesmerizing enchantment that wove itself into the fabric of my being. I knew I had to record it, to share it with the world. Perhaps then, its ethereal allure could touch others as it had touched me. Little did I know, I was about to unleash a power whose consequences would ripple through countless lives. With trembling hands, I began recording the track, pouring every ounce of emotion into the performance. As the final note faded, I was struck by a profound sense of unease, as if something is amiss. Something dark and unknowable was laying its gaze upon me. But the song was definitely a masterpiece, a haunting and sublime work of art, and like a moth drawn to a flame, I couldn't resist the urge to share it. I uploaded it to all the major streaming platforms, watching with bated breath as it slowly gained traction. At first, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Critics raved about the song's haunting beauty and emotional depth. Fans flooded my social media, praising the song and begging for more, utterly captivated by its enchanting melody. It will change the world, they said. Oh, change it did. The messages from fans singing praises took a dark turn. Reports began trickling in, stories that chilled me to my very core. Give me a moment. I paused, taking a sip of water to wet my dry mouth. The crowd leaned forward, hanging on my every word. I continued. People began reporting strange occurrences after listening to the song. Nightmares plagued their sleep, vivid and terrifying visions that left them drenched in sweat and paralyzed with fear. They spoke of shadowy figures lurking in the corners of their vision, disappearing the moment they turned their gaze. At first, I tried to brush it off as overactive imaginations, the product of suggestible minds. But the reports kept pouring in, each more disturbing than the last. Some claimed to hear whispers in the night, disembodied voices calling to them from the shadows, beckoning them to surrender to the darkness. Others reported unexplained injuries, deep gashes and bruises appearing on their bodies overnight, as if they had been attacked by some unseen force. I received photographs that turned my stomach, flesh torn and mangled, streaked with crimson. A few even went missing without a trace, their loved ones left to wonder what dark fate had befallen them. Frantic searches turned up no clues, no hints as to their whereabouts. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. I shuddered. All these incidents had a single common attribute. They had all heard my song, It was then that I realized the terrible truth. My song had become a vessel for something sinister, a conduit through which an evil entity could seep into our world. A malevolent entity that seeks nothing but darkness, human suffering, and despair. I tried to take the song down, to erase it from the internet, and undo the damage I had wrought. But it was too late. The melody had taken on a life of its own, spreading like a virus through the airwaves and infecting all who heard it. The reports grew more dire with each passing day. Entire families were found dead in their homes, their bodies contorted in expressions of sheer terror. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, archaic sigils that seemed to pulse with an unholy energy. The scenes were straight out of a nightmare, a glimpse into the abyss that had been unlocked. I became a pariah, shunned and reviled by those who had once praised my work. Rumors spread that I had consorted with dark forces, that I had willingly opened a doorway to the abyss. People followed me wherever I went, accusing eyes burning into my back. I tried to warn them, to make them understand that I was a victim too, a mere pawn in a cosmic game of chess played by forces beyond our comprehension. But my pleas fell on deaf ears, drowned out by the growing chorus of fear and hatred. As I stand here before you tonight, I can't help but feel a profound sense of guilt and regret. I unleashed a force beyond my control, all in the pursuit of artistic expression. And now the world teeters on the brink of oblivion, the shadows closing in, hungry for the souls of the living. So I implore you, my friends, heed my warning. Do not seek out the shadows, no matter how beautiful or captivating it may seem. For once they take root in your mind, there is no turning back. The shadows are watching, waiting for their chance to strike. And before you find them, they will find you. I let the final haunting chord ring out, the melody fading into silence. The bar was deathly quiet, the patrons frozen in stunned awe, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and fascination. A few exchanged nervous glances, as if wondering if I spoke the truth. A sinister smile broke on my face. And now, my dear listeners, you have all heard this song too. I stepped away from the microphone and made my way off the stage, walking toward the exit amidst the audience that was paralyzed with fear, processing what I had just said. However, as I made my way off the stage, I couldn't help but feel a dark satisfaction. They were now entwined with this melody, just as I am, and there was no escape from its enchanting grip.